Hey, everybody, we are going to continue on with chapter 6, the skeletal system. So within this, we're going to kind of break this into two parts. We're going to talk about our bone structure and kind of our bone anatomy, physiology side of things in the first part. And then in the second part, we'll talk about our actual skeleton and bones themselves, in terms of what types of bones we have, how we classify our bones, all that kind of stuff. So this first part, we're going to do a little bit more of the background, kind of how our bones work, how they're made. So let's get started. Okay, so we have a few different components to our skeletal system. Of course, we have the bones themselves. We also have a few different types of cartilages. We mentioned those in the prior chapters. Tendons, those are going to be our muscle to bone. So muscle to bone is our tendons. And then our bone to bone connection is going to be our ligaments. So all of those are components of the skeletal system. So our functions of the skeletal system, support is an obvious one. It gives us our support and our structure. It's protection for our organs. So our rib cage is protective for our heart and our lungs. Our vertebrae are protective of our spinal cord. Our skull is protective of our brain. So it has a protection function for a lot of our vital organs. Movement itself, so our muscles are responsible for generating the movement, but our muscles are attached to our bones via tendons. So our bones themselves are what are moved by our muscles to make movement happen. Mineral storage, we will talk about in a few minutes down the line here. And then blood cell production is a less obvious function of our skeletal system, but we will talk about the two different types of bone marrow and how that comes into play. Okay, bone histology, or our study of bone tissue. So bone, cartilage, tendons, and ligaments are all in the connective tissue category. And if you remember when we talked about connective tissue, their characteristics and their function are largely determined by their extracellular matrix, or the composition of that extracellular matrix. And so collagen is almost always going to be there as our main protein. We have ground substance, which is our other substances that are not proteins. And then there's other organic molecules. There's inorganic molecules such as water. And then there's also a lot of different minerals there as well. So as we said before, collagen is a fibrous protein, and it gives a lot of flexibility, but also strength. So it primarily resists pulling or compression. So it gives bone some of its strength. So the ground substance itself contains these crystals known as proteoglycans, and these trap water and they help cartilage more than bone become smooth and resilient. Our tendons and ligaments, the extracellular matrix of those, they have even more collagen fibers, which make them extremely tough. So you can think of our tendons and ligaments like a rope or a cable, in terms of being very strong. So for bone itself, the matrix is about 35% organic material, about 65% inorganic material. A majority of that organic material is going to be collagen and those proteoglycans. Our inorganic material is primarily something known as calcium phosphate crystal. Another word for this that you see more commonly is hydroxyapatite. So of course, do not memorize this little formula here, but you should know that hydroxyapatite is the primary inorganic material. Calcium phosphate crystal and hydroxyapatite are synonymous. Those are the same thing. Of course, we said collagen fibers give a lot of flexible strength to the bone, and it resists that tension or stretch component. And then we have our mineral aspect that gives the bone a lot of compressive force or strength against our weight bearing. And if you remember back from our previous chapter, we said that one thing bone is not good at is resisting torsional force or a twisting force. Okay, let's touch on our bone cells again. So we talked about this a little bit in our last chapter and in the tissues chapter, but our osteoblasts are builders. So remember, blasts build. So these are going to be responsible for formation of bone and also repairing or adding to the bone. So they're going to produce both collagen and proteoglycans, the two important components for the strength. They also secrete a lot of calcium and phosphate. So these will assist in forming those hydroxyapatite crystals. And so when our osteoblasts lay down and form new bone, we call that ossification. Ossification, or that's what creating new bone is called. Okay, osteocytes are our maintenance cells. So they're going to maintain our bone matrix. And so osteocytes are mature osteoblasts. So after our bone extracellular matrix has surrounded an osteoblast completely, it kind of matures or transforms into an osteocyte. So these are a majority of our bone cells are osteocytes. Remember we said they're housed in these small spaces called lacunae. So within our bone structure, there's little pockets where our osteocytes can live or be housed. And then there's extensions from these called canaliculi. And we'll look at these in a picture in a little bit. Osteoclasts, remember clasts crush, these are going to be our bone destroying cells. So when our bones are going through repairing or remodeling, which we'll discuss the difference in a bit, our clasts are what remove our extra or existing bone, and we call this reabsorption. So even though the clasts are breaking down bone, we aren't necessarily just getting rid of that. We're more recycling it. So that's why it's termed reabsorption. By breaking down bone, we can gain more calcium into the bloodstream. So calcium is really important for stuff such as muscle contraction. If you think about your virtual lab on skeletal muscle, and we'll go through the muscular system lecture next, we'll see that calcium is essential for muscle contraction. And so there's always this balance going on in the body between calcium in the bone in terms of making sure that we have enough calcium and enough structure to our bones, and also having enough calcium available in our bloodstream to donate to the muscles. So this is developing bones. You see these are osteoblasts. So they're laying the bone down, and then as the bone is fully formed, they transform to osteocytes. All right, we have two types of bone, spongy bone and compact bone. So our mature bone is called lamellar bone because it's organized into these sheets or layers known as lamellae. And so the way or the difference between spongy and compact is more or less how much space is between the bone and its matrix. So in our spongy bone, not a whole lot of matrix yet, more space. In our compact bone, there's minimal matrix, and it's pretty much all bone. So there's really not much space. So spongy has space, kind of looks like a sponge. It's got those gaps, and then compact, it's all the way packed tight. So our spongy bone is a bunch of interconnecting rods or plates of bone called trabeculae, but they're not tightly packed in. So there's spaces in between the trabeculae. And so in between these spaces, we have room for stuff such as like bone marrow, and then also for our blood vessels to be able to run. And our surface of our trabeculae is lined with a single layer of cells that kind of surrounds it, which will have some osteoblasts and a very few osteoclasts. So this is still remodeling bone. So our spongy bone, you see we have compact here, You can't see any space. It's really tight. Our spongy bone, a lot more spaces. Zoomed in, you see it's got plenty of spaces. So this would have bone marrow and blood vessels running through. And then if you look here for something all the way tightly packed, you see this outer layer. So this is a zoom in of this rod. This outer layer, mostly osteoblast and some osteoclast. And then the layers that are already developed, where we're organized into these rings or lamellae, you see the osteocytes are sitting here in the lacunae, and they're surrounded by extracellular matrix. So once we get all the way filled in, we become an osteocyte, but our outer layer is going to have those immature blasts and clasts that are still laying down and breaking down bone. So spongy bone is also called trabecular bone. Our compact bone is also known as cortical bone, and it's going to be that solid outer layer that surrounds all of our bones. When we speak of the functional unit of a bone, we're not talking about an osteocyte. So the functional unit isn't the functional or the base cell. Our functional unit is what's known as an osteon. So it's a group of those concentric rings or lamellae, and it surrounds this central canal. So we'll go through a picture of this so that it's easier to visualize. So our central canals are lined with what's known as our endosteum, and this is where our blood vessel, nerves, and some loose connective tissue is maintained in our compact bone. So remember those rings that kind of look like a tree trunk? Those are called lamellae in our bone. And so they surround that central canal. We have our osteocytes in those spaces or pockets known as lacunae. And then we have small tunnels that connect our lacunae across the lamellae known as canaliculi. And so these connect our osteocytes to one another. And the reason we have this is to transport nutrients between osteocytes and also remove waste from the metabolic processes in those cells. So you see we have our central canal here, our rings here, our lamellae, our green osteocytes here are tucked into the lacunae. And then if you look down here, you can see the canaliculi that are traveling in between. So this is our outer layer. And then if we go to the inner layer, now we have our spongy bone. So outer layer is going to be compact bone. That inner layer where our bone marrow is our spongy bone. So you guys should know these different terms related to structure of a long bone. So the first thing is the diaphysis. This is going to be the center portion of the bone. So this is going to be mostly compact bone. It's going to be our hollow center, which is called our medullary cavity. So within the medullary cavity, we do have some spongy bone that lines it, and that helps maintain our bone marrow and blood supply. At the ends of our long bone, we're going to have the epiphyses. So these are going to be the two ends, the proximal and the distal end of the bone. Our epiphyses are going to be mostly spongy bone. It'll still have an outer layer of compact bone for some strength, but a majority of it is spongy bone, whereas in our diaphyses, it's mostly compact bone with just a little bit of spongy bone in the middle. So within our joint, that epiphysis, or the end of our long bones, is going to be covered by hyaline cartilage, which is why we also call it articular cartilage. Another term that you probably haven't heard stated this way is our epiphyseal plate, which is located between our epiphysis and diaphysis. What most of you will know it as is our growth plate. So our growth plate is the epiphyseal plate. And so this is where growth in our bones actually occurs in terms of lengthening. So when our epiphyseal plate is open, or our growth plate is open, that means that our bones are still growing longer. When our epiphyseal plate stops growing, our length does not change in our bones anymore. and it's known as the epiphyseal line. So that epiphyseal plate or our growth plate becomes fully ossified. So there's no more room for new cells to fill in. The lengthening of our bone stops. All right, bone marrow. We can find this in the cavities of spongy bone. So the medullary cavity, remember we mentioned that as the middle portion of our diaphysis, that's going to have some marrow. We can have red marrow, which is where our blood cells are going to be formed. And then we have yellow marrow, which is mostly just going to be fat. So in the fetus, a majority of the spaces are filled with red marrow because we need to generate more and more blood cells. And just before you're born, some of that red marrow begins to get converted to yellow marrow. And as we mature and get older, more and more of the red marrow is converted to yellow marrow. As an adult, most of our red bone marrow is going to be in our flat bones. So some examples of this are your sternum, and then our longer bones like our femur, which is your big thigh bone, or your humerus, which is your upper arm bone, is going to be yellow marrow at that point. So this just shows kind of a highlight of all the different structures in our long bone. Remember, the end is going to be covered in that hyaline cartilage or articular cartilage. The epiphysis is going to be the end of the bone. So you see in a younger bone, it's much spongier versus an adult bone. You see the epiphyseal plate in the juvenile bone, whereas you just have the epiphyseal line as an adult because it's all the way filled in. It's an overall more spongy bone in the young bone, but you're going to see that compact bone in the outer portion of both adult and young bone. The medullary cavity, remember, in kids, majority of it's going to be red. As we are adults, most of our long bones are going to be yellow. The periosteum is the outermost covering of the bones, and the endosteum is the inner lining of the bones. So speaking of the periosteum and endosteum, I just said the periosteum is that outer surface, and it's connective tissue. And so it's got blood vessels and nerves. And it also includes some of our inner, the inner layer of our periosteum includes some osteoblasts and osteoclasts, or the actual bone cells themselves. And so this is where our tendons and ligaments actually attach to a bone. So fibers of the tendon or ligament run directly into and become intertwined or continuous with the bone's periosteum. The endosteum is on the interior or the deep part of the bone. It's going to be a single layer of connective tissue, and it's going to line kind of the entire internal surface within our bone. This also will include osteoblasts and osteoclasts for building and taking away bone. So bones don't just appear, they're actually formed, and it goes in two different processes. We have intramembranous ossification. So this starts with embryonic connective tissue membranes, and then we have endochondral ossification, and this is where a majority of our long bones are formed, and this is where we start with cartilage and then convert them into actual bone cells. So both of these types create both compact and spongy bone. So within the fetus, we have what's known as intramembranous ossification. And so what that more or less means is that these bones are already there as a membrane or a covering, and it just goes through the calcification or hardening process. So if you've ever heard about a fetus or a really not a fetus, but an infant having soft spots in its skull, it's because of this intramembranous bone ossification. So it starts where it's as a membrane or covering, and it begins hardening. Those soft spots that are found in the skull make it so that it's flexible enough to make it through the birth canal. And then as it goes through the ossification process, our fontanelles end up becoming these sutures in our skull where they're fully hardened and connected to one another. And then most of our long bones and other bones in our body go through this endochondral bone formation concept. So intramembranous is mostly the skull, and endochondral is a majority of our long bones. You don't need to memorize this entire chart here. I just need you to get the big picture. So what happens initially is that we just have a piece of cartilage that starts our bone there. The perichondrium is just the outer covering of our cartilage. So our periosteum begins to form. So our perichondrium begins to kind of convert to a periosteum, and we begin to get blood vessel or vascular access to our periosteum. So it's going to start getting nutrients. Further along, that cartilage piece is going to start what's known as a primary ossification center. So we're going to start to lay down spongy bone to replace some of this cartilage. You'll see a secondary ossification center form in the epiphysis. And so now we have the medullary cavity, or that center portion of our diaphysis, and some spongy bone in the epiphysis. And that will continue to remodel until we have that compact bone on the outside, spongy bone on the inside. And in a kid, we would have that epiphyseal plate until it fully matured. So like I said, don't need to remember this every single detail. You just need to know we start from cartilage, primary ossification center in the diaphysis, secondary in the epiphysis, and that's how we end up remodeling fully. Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about is bone remodeling versus bone repair. So bone remodeling means that our osteoclasts are removing some existing bone, and our osteoblasts are laying down new bone. So this is going to occur in all of our bones. And so this is how our bone shape changes. If we have certain stress on a certain area of a bone, it's going to respond by building this up more. And this is also how we regulate our calcium ion level in our blood. When we discuss bone repair, on the other hand, we're going to be talking about actually breaking a bone. And so when a bone is broken, it causes bleeding because our periosteum and our endosteum are supplied with blood vessels. And so that's going to cause a hematoma, or a big gathering of blood. We're going to form what's known as a callus, which is where we lay down kind of a cartilage network around the fragments of the bone. And then our cartilage, just like an endochondral ossification, is going to start to be converted to actual bone tissue or spongy bone to replace that cartilage callus. And then where we're supposed to have our compact bone, that will replace the spongy bone initially. So this just takes you step by step. So we get bleeding there because of the blood supply. So a hematoma, or a big blood grouping, is going to form. We're going to end up laying down cartilage here as a callus. That callus turns into spongy bone, and bone remodeling will eventually take over to lay down compact on the edges where we need it, and spongy in the medullary cavity. So I said earlier when we were talking about bone function that our calcium concentration in our blood is vital because of some functions such as muscle contraction. So in terms of maintaining our calcium homeostasis, we need to balance, like I said, how much calcium we're dedicating to the bones and how much calcium we allow to stay free in the bloodstream. So we mainly need calcium besides our muscle contraction for exocytosis of molecules, um, which is an important process to be able to use our nerves for signaling. So, of course, our bones are a major storage site for calcium. And so, as our blasts are building new bone, they need more calcium available. As blasts break down bone, we can send more calcium to the bloodstream. And the way that we actually maintain this homeostasis or determine whether we're going to break down or build up is by the hormone parathyroid hormone, and also calcitonin. So those two hormones are going to dictate whether we build more bone and bring calcium into the bone, or are breaking down more bone and putting more calcium into the bloodstream. Okay, we are going to go ahead and cut part one here. This is a good time to take a break, and we will come back with part two, where we talk about our actual skeletal anatomy and the bones that make up our skeleton.